Everyone. Welcome to the Friday weekly update for the North Carolina Child Advocacy Network. Friday, April 29th, 2022. Hope you're all doing well. My name is Adam Sotok, and I'm the Community Engagement Director here at NC Child. I'm going to introduce our speakers here in just a moment, but before I do that, I wanted to make a quick announcement. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. I'll be introducing the speakers in just a moment, but this session is completely bilingual in English and Spanish. We have a live interpreter on the line. Everyone will need to choose either the Spanish or English channel to hear the audio. If you do not choose an audio channel, you may not be able to hear the presenters. To choose a channel, look for the little image of a globe and the word interpretation on the bottom right side of your Zoom screen. Click that and choose Spanish or English. If you choose the Spanish channel, you will hear the interpreter speaking in Spanish. You will also be able to hear the English language presenters at a low volume in the background. Presenters, this is for you. Please be sure to speak slowly and clearly and take some breaks while you're talking. That will make our interpreter's job much easier. This is for everyone. We have quite a few participants on this webinar, so we're going to keep everyone on mute to preserve audio quality. However, to ask the presenters a question at any time during the presentation, type your question into the chat box at the bottom of your screen. We encourage you to use this for general comments or to communicate with the moderator. Finally, this session is being recorded. The video will be available later today in both English and Spanish. We'll send you an email when all the recorded sessions are available. And with that, I would like to introduce our interpreter, Mercado, to say these directions in Spanish.
Thank you, Adam. And first of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this event for their commitment to language justice and creating multilingual spaces. Primero que nada, queremos agradecer a los organizadores de este evento por su compromiso a la justicia del lenguaje y a la creación de estos espacios bilingües. Si usted se unió a esta llamada, por favor vaya a la parte inferior de la pantalla y haga clic en el botón que parece un mundo, elija español para que pueda participar y escuchar en español. Si usted nos está conectando desde una computadora, pero desde un teléfono celular inteligente o una tableta, en la parte, haga clic en la pantalla, vaya a la parte inferior de su pantalla donde dice más, elija interpretación del lenguaje y elija el canal de español y después ponga terminar para activar esta función. Muchísimas gracias. Cualquier consulta, por favor, utilice el chat. Back to you, Adam. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mercado, as always. So our agenda here is in front of us, and I'm really excited to hear from Vikki Crouse, our Kids Count Project Director today. Our 2022 county data cards are out and they're beautiful, and I know that many of you all have already accessed and taken a look at those. We're also going to be getting a legislative update from our policy director, Tiffany Gladney. As you all know, the legislative session will get moving in earnest here in a few weeks, and then at the end we'll have time to talk about some things we have coming up and get any announcements from you all as well. So I'm about to turn it over, but just for a second, I felt like I might be remiss. This day weighs on my mind in some ways, and today I was thinking about it. 30 years ago today was the Rodney King decision, and I was a senior in high school in Salisbury, and LA riots broke out, and it was just a time where it was very painful in a lot of ways, I know, for a lot of folks, but I started to reflect on kind of like, where are we traveling, over these past 30 years and how are things progressing, et cetera. So, that's just something that's been on my heart and mind. It's also an interesting day because today was the first Moral Monday, April 29th, 2013. So, just been kind of reflecting on that kind of duality in those dates. as we meet together here today. And of course, this data and information that Vikki's going to share is, something we can all use for the power of making the changes that we want to see. So without any further ado, I am going to turn it over to Vikki Crouse.
Thanks, Adam, and thank you all so much for joining us this morning. We're so excited to be reunited with you all virtually. I'll go ahead and share my screens. See here. Great. So as Adam mentioned, we're going to be giving an overview of the most recent county data card release that we released this past week. And so it's a really exciting week at NC Child because all of us who like to geek out about data are really excited to see these go out into the world and be used by communities and child advocates like yourselves. And so what was exciting about this year's release is that, as many of you know, our data sources often tend to be delayed by 1 or 2 years, just due to the amount of work that goes into collecting data and analyzing it every year. And so our most current data is data from usually 2 or 1 years prior. And so this year, for the first time, we were able to have access to data from the first year of the pandemic for many data sources, and be able to talk about and think about what the impact of the pandemic was, the early days of the pandemic, and also the impact of the relief policies, the COVID relief policies that we saw in that first year. And so as part of this release, just as a reminder, last year, we actually, for the first time, started providing data disaggregated by race and ethnicity at the county level through our interactive county and state data dashboard, which we've created through Tableau. And so this year, we have updated that dashboard and have added now a year filter so that you all can see data that we released last year. And going forward, we'll just be adding data to that dashboard so that you can compare data across years. I will note that we did see some small changes to some of the data sources for our data this year, and that's simply because of the impact of the pandemic. That was one thing that you all might have noticed, that we released our data cards this year a little bit later than usual, and it was because of the impact of the pandemic on data collection. The Census Bureau in particular, which is a big data source for ours, shut down its processes in the first part of 2020. They weren't going around and following up door to door with folks. And so it was really difficult to collect that critical data. So we did see delays there. And then the other resource that we share through this release is our traditional downloadable, printable PDF data cards, and the state data card that you all can print out and use in your in-person advocacy work with decision makers. And so we're excited for you all to explore those 2 resources. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the data highlights, the top lines that we saw. And before we jump into those, I want to highlight, there's been a lot that's happened these past 2 years. And I think it's good to kind of provide a baseline of, what are the key policies that we're talking about when we look at the impact that it had on children and families. And so we know that, thanks to timely federal and state response during 2020, our country saw the shortest recession on record. And we know that these key policies help protect families from the worst impacts of poverty. Everything from direct cash payments for low and middle income families through stimulus checks and the expanded child tax credit in 2021 to increased food assistance benefits for programs like SNAP, uninterrupted health insurance coverage for people enrolled in Medicaid, and increased rental assistance, as well as an eviction moratorium that protected a lot of families from homelessness. So these are some of the key policies that we saw, that were used in those first 2 years to really help families. And so studying the data from the first year of the pandemic, we have 3 top takeaways that we want to share. One, we clearly have the tools to fight poverty, and now we know that they work based on the data evidence. These pandemic policies, as I shared, really buffered children in particular from the worst impacts of poverty. Health coverage remained stable in the first year of the pandemic for children and adults, and children's reading proficiency was worsened by the pandemic as reflected by 3rd grade reading scores. And this last point in particular, we'll talk a little bit more about as we look at that indicator, but it's no surprise that the pandemic really interrupted learning for kids. And I think now, the thought is, and as you all might remember, state reading and math assessments were canceled the first year of the pandemic. And so the latest data is from 2020, 2021. And we can see the significant learning loss that occurred. So the question now really for our decision makers is, how do we develop plans and designate appropriate investment in public education so that kids can make up that learning loss that has occurred? So let's talk for a moment about state demographics. We know that North Carolina is home to more than 2 million children, and nearly 1 in 3 of them are under the age of 6. So we see that a third of our kids in North Carolina are in a very early and critical stage of development as their bodies continue to grow and their brains continue to develop. We see from the data that the majority of children in our state are white, but the second largest group is Black children, followed by Hispanic and Latinx children, and American Indian children. And this is relevant because as we walk through these indicators, you might note, increases or declines, sometimes sharp increases in county data on any given indicator compared to the state totals. And sometimes those differences are really driven by racial disparities. So it's important for us to think about the demographics of the counties that we're interested in as we look at the indicators. And on a related note, one thing that was interesting about the data this past year was getting to explore the results of the decennial census. You all remember the 2020 census happened. I know it feels like it was 5 years ago, but it did happen. And the new data census really revealed how much more racially diverse North Carolina has gotten over the past decade. And we saw that the increased racial diversity was largely driven by Hispanic and Latinx, multiracial, and Asian residents in North Carolina. And among our youngest residents, the state child population remained largely the same over the past decade, increasing only by a mere about 2,600 children, or 0.1%. And NC Child actually published a couple of blog posts, one of them that gives a more detailed demographic breakdown of the changes, and another one that was recently published by our awesome research fellow, Lori Shaker, that talks about the concern of an undercount of children that we also saw in the census and the consequences of that. So let's go ahead and jump into some of the indicators. And for all of these, I share a table on this slide with the highest and lowest rates that we saw for each of these indicators. And so when it comes to child poverty, this is something that is always top of mind for us because it's such an important indicator of child and family well-being. We know that children who live in financially secure families are more likely to succeed in school and stay healthy in the long term. Before the pandemic, 2 out of 5 kids, or 44.5%, lived in poor or low-income homes. In 2020, the latest full year for which we have data, we saw childhood poverty actually decrease to 42.8% of NC children who are living in poor or low-income homes. So that's good news. And yet it's terrible news because still almost half of kids in our state are living in poor or low-income homes. So that's not acceptable, but this is an indicator that has been trending in the right direction. And we see how federal and state policies really help to protect children from the pandemic during that first year. Particularly things like the 1-year expansion of the child tax credit reduced child poverty to historically low levels in 2021, as according to weekly data that was collected by the US Census Bureau Household Pulse Survey. And so this showed us that child poverty is a problem that we have the power to solve, and so we don't have to accept it as a given. We also know from research that the children who are most at risk of living in poor low-income homes are Black and Latinx children, because we see this reflected in the data, and we're talking about decades of barriers to economic opportunity for families. We know that Black and brown children are more likely to be relegated to neighborhoods with less resources. Also, children under the age of 6, because they're more likely to be born to younger parents who are less financially established. and children who are living in rural counties. We're talking about kids who are more likely to live in poverty compared to children in more urban counties, because they tend to lack access to a lot of the basic needs and resources that we, kind of take for granted here, that are harder to access in more rural areas. So you can see on the table, and you will have all the time to look at the data in detail, but we can see that the trends that we know from the research certainly kind of make sense with the data that we're seeing. The more urban counties having the lowest rates of child poverty in North Carolina, and rural counties really taking the harder hit. So food insecurity is also closely tracks along with child poverty. And it's a really important indicator because it's key to, as we think about the young kids in our state, that brain development and long-term health, really tied to food and nutrition support. We know that the pandemic has led to a higher than ever demand for food and nutrition support, and has deepened a hunger problem that we already saw so stark in so many counties. At the beginning of the pandemic, we were talking about food insecurity as a result of massive job and income loss. But even now, we continue to grapple with the COVID-related surge of food and fuel prices that will likely contribute to rising food insecurity over the next year. And we don't have data for that yet. One thing I want to point out, as you might have noticed from the table, the data that we included in this year's data cards is actually from 2019. Our data source has not released 2020 data, but is actually planning to do that over the next month. So we will separately release that data, put out a blog post and make sure that you all have that data and our analysis for it soon, because this, as I mentioned, is something that we really care about and we know is an important indicator of child well-being. But even in 2019, 1 in 5 children were experiencing food insecurity, and we see wide variances by county. We see that North Carolina's hungriest counties are concentrated mostly in the eastern part of the state, with Washington, Tyrrell, Scotland, Bertie, and Northampton counties making up the top 5 counties for food insecurity. When it comes to health insurance, we also know that health coverage is a key indicator for family financial stability and for children's healthy development. And despite widespread job losses in 2020, including loss of employer-sponsored health insurance for a lot of parents, the rate of children without health insurance remained fairly stable across the state at around 5.3%. Medicaid and other public health insurance programs played a critical role in promoting and protecting health coverage for children and financial stability for families. We mentioned earlier the uninterrupted health coverage for kids and adults enrolled in Medicaid, and we really saw this make a difference for kids during the first year of the pandemic. The counties with the highest rates of uninsured children are mostly concentrated in the northeast corner of the state. More than 10% of kids are uninsured in Hyde, Currituck, Duplin, and Perkiomen counties. In Swain County, almost 1 in 4 have no health coverage. So this is clearly just unacceptable. And statewide, 12% of adults had no health coverage in 2020. On this note, to keep people covered, Congress has put forth some really key incentives for states like North Carolina who haven't expanded our Medicaid program to be able to cover more low-income adults. And so the state legislature is now considering Medicaid expansion. I'm sure we'll hear more about that in the legislative update, but that is certainly one tool that we have that can be really effective in driving down uninsurance rates across the state. When it comes to education, whether a child can read on grade level by 3rd grade is a vital touch point for success throughout life. Children on track in 3rd grade are significantly more likely to graduate high school on time, attend college, and earn more later in life. And we know that parents and policymakers were rightly concerned about the impact of the pandemic and remote learning on these critical 3rd grade reading scores. So we see from the data just the vast changes in the third grade reading levels. We didn't provide data from the previous year because there wasn't any. They canceled the tests for that school year, and we didn't want to do a skip year comparison. But we do know that when we looked at the 2018-2019 data for third grade reading, we did see an increase in the number of kids who were not reading proficiently by third grade. And so that is really concerning for us. And we know when we think about solutions, as I mentioned, learning loss is something that we now have to grapple with. We know that one of the most effective educational tools for school readiness and reading success is high quality early education. Investing in early education and childcare programs now is an important tool that policymakers have to get kids on track for learning later on in their school years. And finally, to round us out, I want to talk a little bit about birth outcomes. In 2020, nearly 6.9 infants per 1,000 died before their first birthday in North Carolina. We know that having health insurance is a significant predictor of whether or not people who give birth are very likely to have kids who are born full term and at a healthy weight. We also know from the data that race is an important factor for this indicator. We see that for decades, researchers have documented the higher maternal and infant mortality rates in the US compared with other industrialized countries. So that is something unique to our country, and how Black women and infants in particular are more likely to experience complications and death. What we know from the data in North Carolina is that the infant mortality rate has been declining over the past decade. But when we break down the data by race and ethnicity, we see that outcomes are not the same across racial and ethnic groups. Black babies are more than twice as likely to die before their first birthday compared to white babies, and that is simply unacceptable. So we know that this remains an area of concern, and we know from being able to disaggregate the data by race and ethnicity that we have to target solutions in a way that help all babies and all families be able to have a healthy life. And given that we continue to see this, and one of the things that was challenging about this data in particular was that while infant mortality rate has been declining statewide, maternal mortality rate, which tracks alongside this, right, because we're talking about prenatal care, actually worsened significantly during 2020. A recently published report from the National Center for Health Statistics found that for all birthing people, the number of maternal deaths rose 14% during the first year of the pandemic. And while they didn't specifically mention the pandemic, experts said that it was natural to assume that things like the pandemic strain on hospitals and healthcare providers, plus the lack of a vaccine at the time, may have heightened the barriers that people of color already have when accessing healthcare. So that's important context to also think about as we think about infant mortality rates. And with that, I know that was a lot of information to throw at you all. I hope that you all take the time to go through our interactive data dashboard. You can access it at the link on the slide. The slide is also hyperlinked if you want to look at the PDF later. And just as a reminder, we also have the PDF data cards that you can download and print out for, conversations with your leaders, community leaders, and decision makers. And if you all have any questions, feel free to go ahead and unmute yourselves. But thank you all so much for letting me share this data with you.
Thank you very much, Vikki. Really appreciate all the wonderful work you've done on this. And it's a great resource everywhere we go. This is the most talked about piece of data we really have, and people use the cards and use this as a resource, I know. So, did we have any questions?
I have a quick question. Sorry, I should turn on my video. I have a quick question. Vikki, I know you talked about the third grade reading scores and the difference. What was I can't remember exactly, but what was the difference when you did the skip year comparison from like the 2018-2019 scores to the 2021 scores? Do you remember like approximately what? I think it was one of the biggest changes we saw in these cards, right?
Yeah, it was a 10%, it was a 10 percentage point drop. So really significant. For the state total. I didn't pull it by race and ethnicity. I'd have to go back and refer to data from last year's data cards, but for the state total, it was a really significant drop. So that is really worrisome. And yes, you know, all of the other indicators really saw only marginal changes. But for education in particular, I mean, we're talking not just an interruption to in-person learning, but just the mental health toll, food insecurity, all of those things, while families, you know, struggle to connect to resources, had a toll on how, you know, kids were able to learn. Great.
Right. Yeah, thanks so much, Vikki. I mean, it's important data and certainly some sobering numbers in there as well. So at this point in time, I would now like to shift over to our policy director, Tiffany Gladney. Tiffany.
Happy Friday, y'all. And I just want to give Vikki tons of kudos again, because the work that she does is not easy, and she does it with such grace and poise. So shout out to Vikki again. Thank you for what you do. It all matters. So y'all, when it comes to what is going on at the legislature, as y'all might have heard, the 2021 long session just wrapped a mere month ago, literally a month ago. And of course, broke state records as the longest session in the General Assembly's history. But they're about to come back already, y'all. The legislature will gavel in, signifying the beginning of short session on May 18th. And as always, we will keep y'all updated on all the Jones Street happenings. But we wanted to make sure you had a chance to mark your calendars for some notable updates, some notable dates that are coming up. So May 17th is the statewide primary election day. May 18th is when short session begins. And November 8th is the statewide general election. So May 17th, 18th, and November 8th. Keep those dates in mind. And then we have seen some committee activity over the past few months at the legislature. One of the outcomes of the 2021 state budget was the formation of the Joint Legislative Committee on Access to Healthcare and Medicaid Expansion. The committee has met a total of 6 times in 2022, and a wide array of topics and speakers presented their cases as to why the state should or shouldn't expand Medicaid. So meeting topics have included surprise medical billing, the impact of Medicaid expansion on rural communities, the role of telehealth when it comes to access to care, as well as certificate of need, and possibly revising the scope of practice laws that are currently in place. As well as we saw presentations from some guest stars, including the incomparable former Ohio Governor John Kasich. The committee recently concluded its business, actually this week, but they have yet to produce recommendations for the legislature to consider. So stay tuned for more details on that. And then the House Select Committee on an Education System for North Carolina's Future has also been hosting a series of meetings. And this committee is really focused on reimagining the state school system. And the House Select Committee on Strategic Transportation Planning and Long-Term Funding Solutions has also been gathering down on Jones Street. And they've really been looking into and exploring the future of North Carolina's highways and byways and public transportation options and things of that nature. So if you're ever curious about what committees are meeting when, you can always access the legislative calendar on the General Assembly's website. It's on the front page. So you just go to ncleg.gov and it's literally right there on the front page, and you can see all of the calendar, the committee happenings for the weeks to come. So with that, Adam, I will hand it back over to you.
Thanks so much, Tiffany. I'm sure it will be another exciting session as always. All right, so Greg has a cat stepping all over his keyboard, apparently. With that concludes the main part of our agenda for today. But I know, Fawn, we wanted to talk about some upcoming Friday events and trainings as well.
Yeah, thanks, Adam, and thanks, Vikki and Tiffany, for your presentations. We have some great trainings coming up. We're going to try to incorporate a little bit more sort of training and skill building into some of our Friday updates this year. So next Friday, May 6th, we're going to have a training from LaToya Evans, who is a really awesome PR professional, and she's going to talk about how to get your message out into the media. On Friday the 13th, Tiffany will be bringing a good luck legislative preview session. So that'll be kind of what we're watching for, what our partners are watching for, how to track things. And then on the 20th, I'm really excited about this one because our friend Carol Bono is coming from Latinx Ed, and we're going to talk about how you can make an asset-based communications plan for your organization. So for all y'all resilience people out there, we're talking about, working from our strengths to try to do the communications that we can do from our agencies. So that's some of what we have coming up, and hope that you'll tune in for all of those. And just while I'm on the camera for a second, I want to say thank you to many of you who helped us release the county data cards this week. We had 68 CAN partner organizations from across the state help us with that release. And we're just so grateful to all of you. So thanks for helping us get this important information out into the world.
Absolutely. So do we have any other announcements or anything for the good of the whole before we end the call? All right. Well, thank you once again to Vikki and Tiffany and to everyone for joining us today. Hope you have a wonderful weekend. Take care.